Japan has a thriving alternative music scene, and it's starting to make some serious waves internationally too. Over the last 4 months, I've spent a lot of time digging into the Japanese scene, and I've noticed 4 key differences between the Japanese and Western scenes. Today, we're exploring the Japanese alt and metal scene as a whole, from the women leading the genre on the international stage, to how they integrate Japanese culture into their music. And if I'm being real, I think the West might have some lessons to learn. Welcome to the Alternative Breakdown. Let's start off by addressing the most obvious difference between the Japanese and Western alternative music scenes, and that's who's leading it. In the West, the alternative music scene has traditionally been dominated by men, with women really starting to make their mark on the scene since the noughties. Compare that to the Japanese scene, and with this generation of it especially, the vast majority of bigger bands, both commercially and internationally, aren't just female fronted, but full women bands. I had one very simple question I needed an answer for from this section of the video. Why is it mainly these female bands breaking through? The answer was more complex than I thought. Before we get to your baby metal and bandmaids, we need to take a journey back over 40 years, back to 1981, to the birth of Shoya. Shoya were one of the pioneers of the all-female metal bands over in Japan, doing it well before it was cool, and pretty successfully at that. A few years later, you got Princess, who were much softer musically, leaning more towards being pure rock, but they also had a pivotal role to play. Princess are largely seen as one of the first all-female bands to take any form of rock mainstream in Japan, to the point that they became the first all-women band to perform at Tokyo's iconic Nippon Budokan, just 6 years into their journey as a band. Shoya and Princess are truly your generation 1 of all-female bands in Japan. Generation 2 is where you'll start to get into some bands whose name might jump off the page a little bit more for fans of the modern generation. Generation 2 has the likes of Destro's, Mary's Blood, and maybe most importantly, Aldeus. Now, in looking into the bands I've covered on the channel, I'd come across the first few names plenty of times, but Aldeus was a new one to me when researching this, which is criminal, given they are largely regarded as a band that kick-started the all-female boom that we see today. And just 2 years from their formation, Aldeus topped the indie charts and made it to number 15 on the mainstream charts with their album Deep Exceed. That takes us up to today, with the bands I've been covering on the channel that I would class as Generation 3, which is where they have seriously blown up. This covers the likes of Baby Metal, Love Bites and Bandmaids alongside many more. This generation has taken things one step further themselves by starting to seriously tap into the international markets, most notably Baby Metal, who've found worldwide success at this point. I appreciate that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but it's really important context for the first reason behind the boom that we see today. It may sound so simple, but young girls had role models to look up to and believe that they could be anywhere on that stage if they wanted to, surrounded by other women. Whether it's direct influences or just seeing that it could be done, that's 3 generations of women seeing other women succeed in the scene. Now, I can very easily translate this structure into the West as well, with an example being Poppy looked up to Spiritbox, who looked up to Evanescence. And yes, I just listed off the bands in the track End of You, but there's a very distinct difference. Those are not all women bands, they're women-led bands. Now, I hate the female-fronted label in 99% of situations, but this is the 1% where it's important. In the West, we find it pretty standard to have a woman singing in a band of guys, or even a woman playing a bass, for example, in a predominantly male band. However, when you see a band that's made up of entirely women, we treat that as the exception. That's the part that stands out to me the most. The underlying bias that many of us don't even realise we have. In Japan, they seem much more open-minded to this dynamic, to the point it's become the norm. I would be doing artists like the Donnas or the Runaways a disservice to not mention the steps they took for all-women bands in the West. But for me, we currently have the best opportunity in years to put some great female role models on a pedestal, and that's through The Warning. A band like The Warning is critical in the internet age where everything is accessible, as young girls can look at these sisters and realise they can annihilate the drums like Pow if they want to. I know I've gone on a bit of a rant here, but I think it was justified. Let's pull it all together before we move on and I flood you with even more information. Japan allowed space for all women bands to be more prominent decades ago, and because of that, young girls had representation in the scene and role models they could look up to. Why do we not have more bands like that over here in the West? The talent's there, and the role models are becoming more prominent. It's now over to us as a society to not treat this next generation as the exception, but just another awesome band. If we can do that, we can have a wider range of human experience being expressed in our scene, and the growth can be exponential from there. Just to be clear, I'm not saying that Japan has miraculously solved sexism in the scene, or that the West doesn't have some fantastic all-women bands. The key takeaway is that Japan seemed to have built a strong, long-lasting culture where all-women bands aren't automatically branded as unusual. We just need to get off step one. The Japanese scene doesn't exactly hide the fact that it's Japanese. In fact, it embraces it. Japanese culture is massively popular worldwide, with anime and cuisine leading the charge in the modern day. But what does any of this have to do with the alternative music scene in Japan? The answer is everything. The Japanese scene incorporates a ton of elements of Japanese culture into their music, including fashion, idol culture, and anime. When it comes to the fashion, there's a much wider variety of visual identities on display in Japan. In the West, if I say metal band to anybody on the street, they would be able to give me a strong visual identity that would fit the scene perfectly. But Japan isn't as confined to these rules. Lots of Japanese bands opt for either a form of traditional Japanese clothing or the more modern Japanese streetwear style over a traditional Western metal band look. There's perfect examples of this on both sides, with bandmaid wearing the traditional maid cafe outfits and Hanabiye bringing the bright Harajuku street style to the alternative scene. Then you have the anime, which is a whole new discovery pipeline for Japanese bands. It's not surprising that most of your mainstream anime soundtracks are pop music. However, the alt scene still has a massive role in anime. You have the likes of Love Bites featuring in the anime Vlad Love, and a band I'm going to look at soon on the channel, Cold Rain, featuring in several shows like King's Game and Fire Force Op 2, all without compromising their sound as a heavy band. Comparing it to the West, the use of heavier bands in both film and television feels much rarer, closing down a huge potential audience that Western bands could be tapping into. Hell, look how big a deal it was for the scene when Knocked Loose performed on Jimmy Kimmel. That says everything you need to know about how unusual that crossover felt to the Western scene. The key culture tie-in for me here is simple. Japan are simply much more open to these integrations, and the bands are the real winners. The last part I want to tie in from the Japanese culture has to be idol culture and J-pop integrations. Whether you're looking at the formation of the bands, the hooks, or even the live performances, they all seem to tie back to idol culture. The biggest standout example of this has to be Baby Metal, whose signature kawaii metal genre is literally a fusion of metal with idol culture and J-pop. You have the synchronized dance routines and J-pop hooks over the top of the iconic kami band metal background. For all those feel like polar opposites, they blend surprisingly well, and I think I figured out exactly why. It can all be summarised in one simple word that I always seem to come back to with bands that I like: authenticity. All of these bands aren't afraid to stand out and be who they truly are. If you were to take a picture of these bands on stage without any instruments, you wouldn't guess they were in an alternative band at all. The bands I've looked at so far haven't felt the need to separate their identity from their music, and in turn have produced a new flavour of alternative music to showcase on the international stage. When it comes to fans, there's definitely an audience out there for this, and the best comparison is actually in food. You'll have heard people say they want to explore the world through taste, or that the key to a nation's culture is through their food. But you could very much say the same thing about music. All you're doing is swapping the sense of taste for hearing, and you can explore the world sonically from the comfort of your own home and a base camp of rock and metal to branch out from. It's not just Japan that do this, as you have acts like Bloodywood, Skindred, or even Rammstein that are more than happy to integrate elements of their culture into their music. But on the whole, I find it to be pretty rare. As my music taste evolves, I've personally been leaning a lot towards the artsy side of music, so seeing artists put their own culture on display is something I really appreciate. And after all my research, I'm not seeing anywhere doing it on the same scale or as well as Japan are. It's not just the bands that there's a notable difference in either, as the audience dynamic between bands and fans is entirely different from everything I've seen. The foundation of the relationship between fans and bands is built in loyalty, and when it comes to loyalty, Japan is a place like no other, and that applies to the bands too. From my experience here in the West, Following a band for a long time is leveraged as a status symbol. This isn't from your everyday fan, but more from gatekeepers who love to emphasise the fact that they listened to your favourite band when they were still in your nan's dog crate performing. Over in Japan, it doesn't tend to be used to one-up each other, rather to show mutual appreciation for their bands and the journey that they have been on. That one may be a little subjective and opinion-based, but the stark difference in concert etiquette is much more plain to see. If you think of your typical alternative music gigs in the West, you're instantly thinking of out-and-out chaos. Pits, left, right and centre, and fans screaming songs at the top of their lungs are both just staples of our scene, and the acts love it. The story isn't the same in Japan though. Japan is instead much more controlled and choreographed in their interactions with the band. In Japan, for a lot of the time, they stand in silence, taking in the live performance. But there is also a reason for this. A lot of these songs and bands have specific moments for fan interaction, whether it's a dedicated call and response, a pop culture reference that invites audience participation, or some sort of movement. In a sense, it makes the band and audience feel even more connected in the venue, as they know the band will give them their moment, and the band knows their fans are ready for said moment. The easiest example of this has to be Bandmaid, who has one of the most iconic call and responses in the scene. As the rest of the band are taking a short break, Miku steps up with Omajinai time, as she casts a magic spell over the audience alongside her signature pigeon coo sound. The audience knows Omajinai time is coming and actively look forward to it at every concert, as it makes them feel like an active part of the show. The West, of course, has bands that do similar things, but it's not embedded into the culture. It's much more seen as an exception, with a "how are we, insert your city here," to which the fans go "woo," being much more commonplace. It's still fun and gets the crowd going, but it's not as specialised or intimate as it is with a lot of Japanese bands. You also have significantly more organised and synchronised movement in a Japanese crowd, whether it's synchronised headbanging or arm swaying at the exact same tempo, or even specific hand gestures or wave patterns for specific songs. It's honestly really impressive. We do get some arms waving, especially with phone torches, or back in the good old days lighters in the air, but I'll be honest, we kinda suck at it. I look across the crowd and there's different pockets of fans going at different tempos or timings. It's just a bit messy. In Japan, it's all much cleaner and well synchronised, and I don't know how it looks or feels to be in the crowd, but when you see zoomed out shots of these crowds, it looks incredibly impressive. You might wonder how they get everyone on board for these things, especially with people recording or taking photos, but that's another massive difference. Unless specifically stated otherwise by the artists, there is no photos or videos allowed at Japanese gigs. Now, phones have become a very contentious point of concert culture across the world, but that's for another video in the near future. What makes it so important to the audience participation is the fact that there's no distractions. Everyone knows their job and everyone's excited to participate and feel part of something bigger than themselves. When we look at the audience dynamics as a whole, the most interesting part of this to me is what it actually means for the live performances in Japan. From everything I can see, it's a very different experience going to a concert in Japan and in the West, especially to my hometown of Glasgow, which is notoriously rowdy. It seems as though in general, Japanese fans lean into the energy and emotion of a concert in an entirely different way. There's an element of the butterfly effect taking place here too, which is really interesting to me. The different gig etiquette leads to a completely different experience, and in my opinion, it then leads to a much broader demographic feeling welcome to see them live. Again, it's not like you need to be young or special to go to a gig in the West, but I have friends and colleagues in their mid-30s who take one look at our concerts and think, I'm too old for that. In the Japanese alternative scene, they'd be right in amongst their peers, maybe even on the younger side. It's not a comparison game of whose concerts are better, it's just two different experiences that will appeal to two different audiences. I'm meant to be visiting Japan in a few years, so I'll need to try a gig while I'm over there to see for myself. The last thing I've noticed about the Japanese alternative scene, which is vastly different to what we have in the West, has to be what I call the genre time lag. Now, when I say genre time lag, that's not an insult. It's just a fascinating observation. Older styles of music, which were big in the West in the 80s and 90s, such as trad metal, power metal and speed metal, are still both commercially and culturally relevant in Japan. In the West, they're now seen as subcultures or legacy genres, but not over there. That's not to say they don't have your newer styles like the dominant force in the West, metalcore. They have that as well. The Japanese alternative scene seems much happier to allow these older styles and newer styles to coexist, rather than the old making way for the new. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of the time they find their home in these genres, but add some flair with elements of J-pop or other genres. This breathes fresh air into some frankly struggling genres and gives them a home, even if in general it remains as a subculture worldwide. I am of course very aware there are still bands like Sabaton and power metal and Iron Maiden and trad metal kicking about and pulling some fantastic numbers, but the reality is they're becoming legacy at this point. The bands doing it in Japan aren't trying to preserve the old genres, they're actively trying to create a current scene for them. The Japanese scene's attitude towards these genres actually mirrors my favourite thing about Japan as a whole. In the West, we are constantly looking for the next best thing to replace the old, but in Japan, there is comfort in both the old and the new. They have robots serving you sushi right next door to a 70-year-old kisaten, and that's perfect. They have a state-of-the-art subway which is just a few turns away from a 400-year-old temple that's still in use, and that's perfect. Hell, Japan is still the second largest music market in the world, because CDs, vinyls and cassettes are still thriving alongside your streaming platforms. Japan seems to see the value in both the new and the old, and taking it back to the genre time lag, it actually serves a beautiful purpose. Allowing space for all genres to breathe and coexist means that artists aren't forced to abandon their roots or tradition to stay relevant. Instead, the attitude is very much that stacking genres alongside each other is much better than straight up replacing them, which leads to a much richer ecosystem of music out there. The new doesn't have to replace the old, it can complement it just nicely. I appreciate we have covered a lot of ground in this video, so let's bring it all together and see what it actually means. Is the Japanese scene better than the Western scene? No. Is the Western scene better than the Japanese scene? Also no. They're two very different scenes with very different cultures behind them, and that is absolutely perfect. Differences are what makes the world interesting, and if we were all the same, you'd be bored after a day. That's the main thing I've loved about researching the Japanese scene. It's shown me that there's many different ways to build an alternative music culture. Realistically, everyone will have a preference. It's only natural. But take a step back for a moment and you'll find they also actually have a lot in common. They both have some incredibly talented musicians, they both have fantastic music and lyrics, they both have passionate, dedicated fan bases, and they both make people feel. What the hell is music if it doesn't bring people together and make them feel something? Life has its ups and downs, and for every single step of that roller coaster ride, there's a soundtrack there from it. Whether that comes from right next door or on the other side of the world is entirely irrelevant. If it works for you, then it's perfect. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Goodbye.